The light inside the citadel had turned strange, flickering orange through smoke that tasted of burning cedar and silk. You could hear them coming before you saw them, boots on stone. The metallic scrape of weapons being drawn, voices barking commands in a language that made your blood run cold. Through the latticed window, shadows moved like wolves circling prey. Women clutched children closer, pressing themselves into corners that offered no protection. The air itself seemed to compress, heavy with the certainty that what came next would shatter everything. This was not the end. That would have been mercy. This was the beginning of something worse, a fate that survivors would struggle to name, that chroniclers would hesitate to record, that would echo through 8 centuries as a warning about what human beings become when conquest turns into calculated cruelty. Before we go deeper into what unfolded in those streets, I'd love to know where you're watching from. It's extraordinary how a story from 1220 can reach across oceans and centuries to find you wherever you are right now. What happened in Samarkand that year was not random savagery, it was engineered terror, designed with the precision of a military campaign and the coldness of an accountant tallying assets. The city that had stood for over 2,000 years as a jewel of the Silk Road, where Persian poets debated philosophy in gardens and mathematicians mapped the stars, became a laboratory for a new kind of warfare, one that understood women's bodies as weapons against an entire civilization's will to resist. The Mongol horde that arrived at its gates in March of 1220 came not merely to conquer territory, but to perform an experiment in breaking human society so completely that resistance would become unthinkable. And at the center of that experiment were the women of Samarkand, whose suffering was not collateral damage but deliberate strategy. To understand what transpired requires going back 18 months earlier, to a moment when empires collided over a single miscalculation. The Khwarazmian Empire stretched from the Caspian Sea to the borders of India. Wealthy beyond measure from controlling the trade routes between East and West, its ruler, Shah Muhammad II, commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, defended cities with walls 30 feet thick, and had never seriously considered that the scattered horsemen of the Mongolian steppe could threaten his power. That miscalculation would cost him everything. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan of 450 merchants into Khwarazmian territory, a gesture of diplomacy, an attempt to establish peaceful commerce between his expanding empire and the wealthy kingdoms of Central Asia. The governor of Otrar, border city, seized the caravan, accused the merchants of espionage, and executed them all. Their goods were confiscated when Genghis sent 3 envoys to demand justice and the governor's surrender. Shah Muhammad made a choice that historians still study as a case study in catastrophic judgment. He had the lead envoy beheaded and sent the other 2 back with their beards burned off, an unforgivable insult in diplomatic protocol, a declaration that he considered the Mongol Khan beneath consideration. Genghis Khan's response was methodical. He spent a year preparing, assembling an army of over 100,000 riders, gathering intelligence about Khwarazmian defenses, and planning an invasion that would unfold with the complexity of a chess grandmaster playing multiple games simultaneously. What he unleashed was not merely an army, but a systema machine designed to consume empires and transform them into fuel for expansion. By February 1220, that machine had devoured Otrar after a 5-month siege. The governor who had started the war was captured and executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, symbolic justice for a man who had seen and heard. The Mongol merchants and chosen death. But Otrar was just the beginning. Genghis split his forces, sending columns racing across the empire faster than messengers could carry warnings. Bukhara fell in February, its population subjected to systematic classification, spared for their skills, soldiers executed, the rest enslaved. Then the great wheel of the Mongol war machine turned toward Samarkand. The city that awaited them was one of humanity's masterpieces, home to perhaps 100,000 souls. Rose from the Zero-Voshan River Valley like a mirage made permanent. Its blue-tiled domes catching sunlight, its bazaars humming with merchants speaking Persian, Arabic, Turkic, Chinese, and a dozen other tongues. The Registan, the central square, hosted scholars who had translated Aristotle and advanced algebra. Women of noble families studied poetry and astronomy, moving with relative freedom compared to many medieval societies. The city's cosmopolitan sophistication was its pride. That sophistication was about to become its tragedy. Among those women was Zainab, daughter of a prominent Qadiyya judge who interpreted Islamic law. She was 19, educated in literature and music, recently married to a merchant's son. Her days were spent in a courtyard garden, teaching younger cousins to read. Practicing calligraphy, dreaming of children she would someday raise in the safety her family had known for generations. She kept a journal, fragments of which survived in a manuscript that found its way to Damascus decades later, preserved by refugees who carried pieces of Samarkand's memory into exile. In her final entry before the siege, dated March 12, 20, Zainab wrote about spring blossoms in the garden and her husband's promise to bring her turquoise from the mountains. She also mentioned rumors disturbing reports from refugees about cities where entire populations had vanished. Her father dismissed them as exaggerations. Surely no army could sustain such brutality across such distances. Surely walls this thick, defenders this numerous, would deter attack. Surely. On March 15th, Mongol scouts appeared on the horizon. By March 16th, the army had surrounded the city so completely that it seemed to have materialized from the earth itself. Genghis Khan established his command post and sent an ultimatum that was precise in its simplicity. Open the gates, surrender all weapons and wealth, and the city would be spared total destruction. Resist, and no stone would remain standing. The garrison commander, a Turkic officer named Alp Khan, commanded 50,000 troops, a formidable force. But he faced an impossible calculation. The Shah had fled eastward, abandoning his empire to save himself. No reinforcements were coming. The city's merchant elite, terrified of losing their accumulated wealth, pressured the council to negotiate. On the third day, Alp Khan made a desperate gamble. He led nearly the entire garrison in a sortie, hoping to break the siege through sheer shock and violence. It was a massacre. Mongol horse archers had spent lifetimes perfecting the tactics of feigned retreat and envelopment. Alp Khan's forces charged into what seemed like a vulnerable flank, only to find themselves surrounded, showered with arrows from all directions, cut off from the city gates. By sunset, more than 30,000 Khwarazmian soldiers lay dead in the fields outside Samarkand. Alp Khan survived only because Mongol officers wanted high-value prisoners for interrogation. The city's military defense had evaporated in a single afternoon. What followed was not impulsive slaughter, but carefully orchestrated processing. The gates opened on March 19th. Mongol units entered in formation, not as a mob, but as administrators of conquest. The population was herded into the Registan and surrounding squares, family groups forcibly separated. Men were sorted into categories. Those with skills useful to the empire engineers, scribes. Craftsmen were marked for deportation to Mongolia. Former soldiers were identified and marched outside the walls. The executions began immediately, systematic and thorough, designed to eliminate any possibility of rebellion. Chroniclers traveling with the army recorded approximately 30,000 executed in the first wave, their bodies left visible from the city walls as an object lesson. But the men, at least, received the mercy of quick death. What was planned for the women operated according to different logic. Zainab's journal does not describe what happened next. It ends abruptly with the entry about spring blossoms. But Persian historian Juvain, writing 3 decades later with access to survivor testimonies, documented the process with uncomfortable precision. Mongol officers moved through the detained population with interpreters, selecting women according to specific criteria, physical condition, signs of wealth that indicated higher social status. The selection was not random lust, but strategic targeting. They were looking for women whose violation would inflict maximum psychological damage on the community, whose forced disappearance would sever family lineages and social structures. The selected women estimates range from several thousand to over 10,000 were separated into groups. Some were distributed immediately to Mongol soldiers as rewards, a practice standard across nomadic steppe cultures where women captured in war became property. Bearing children who would be raised Mongol, their mothers' identities gradually erased. This was conquest at the level of bloodline, a deliberate contamination of enemy genealogy designed to make future resistance psychologically impossible. How do you rebuild a nation when your children carry the conqueror's face? Others faced a fate that contemporary witnesses struggled to articulate. They were herded into designated compounds where they would remain accessible to Mongol forces for the duration of the army's presence in Samarkand days that stretched into weeks. The chronicler Ibn al-Athir, normally restrained in his prose, wrote that what occurred in those compounds represented a degradation so profound that some women threw themselves from walls or into wells rather than endure another day. Archaeological excavations in the 1960s uncovered one such well near the citadel, its depths containing skeletal remains of women and children, evidence of the choice between violation and oblivion. The Mongol system of conquest relied on a calculation that would have impressed modern psychological warfare specialists. By targeting women in such systematic public ways, they achieved multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. They eliminated the cultural framework for producing the next generation of warriors loyal to Samarkand. They traumatized male survivors so deeply that many would never psychologically recover enough to organize resistance. They created survivors whose very existence would carry the message to other cities. This is what resistance costs. Genghis Khan had learned early in his rise to power that sustainable conquest required breaking not just armies, but identities. A defeated enemy who retains cultural pride will rebel the moment you look away. But an enemy whose families have been absorbed into your lineage, whose women have borne your children, whose social structure has been dismantled at the most intimate level, that enemy stays defeated. The cruelty was not the point. The transformation was. Zanab's fate can be traced through fragments. A Persian manuscript from 1255 mentions a woman matching her description among a group transported to Karakoram, the Mongol capital. She had borne 2 children to a Mongol officer, had learned the language, had become in the bureaucratic language of imperial records, integrated. Her journal, somehow preserved, eventually reached other refugees. Her father, the Qadi who had dismissed the rumors, survived because his legal expertise was useful. He lived 9 more years, continuing to interpret Islamic law under Mongol administration, his mind intact but something fundamental in him permanently broken. He never mentioned his daughter's name again. In June 1220, Genghis Khan departed Samarkand, leaving behind administrators to govern a city that had become a ghost of itself. Population estimates suggest that of the original 100,000 residents, fewer than 20,000 remained, and many of those were marked for deportation. The city's legendary libraries had been ransacked for useful texts, the rest burned. The bazaars stood empty. The gardens where Zainab had studied poetry were trampled into mud. But here is where the Mongol system revealed its genius and its fundamental weakness. Cities, it turns out, are harder to kill than armies. Within 2 years, merchants began returning to Samarkand, drawn by its strategic location on trade routes. The Mongols, despite their brutality in conquest, proved pragmatic in administration. Trade meant taxes. Taxes meant wealth. Under the Pax Mongolica, the empire's iron-fisted peace, the Silk Road would experience its safest, most prosperous era. Samarkand would rebuild, its population recovering, new families moving in to replace those who had been erased. The women whose violation was meant to end a civilization instead became its secret continuity. Their children, raised in Mongol camps, sometimes retained fragments of their mother's memory songs in Persian. Prayers whispered in private, stories about a city with blue domes. Years later, decades later, some of those children would travel back west, carrying inside them complicated inheritances. The bloodlines the Mongols tried to contaminate became bridges. The victims they tried to silence became witnesses. Archaeological work that began in the Soviet era uncovered layers of Samarkand's destruction burn marks. Carbon dated to 1220, mass graves. A sudden break in pottery styles indicating population replacement, but also continuity. Building foundations that were reused, tiles that were salvaged and incorporated into new structures. A civilization that refused to stay buried. The paradox at the heart of what happened in Samarkand is this: the same brutality that was meant to ensure total submission planted the seeds for the Mongol Empire's eventual fragmentation. By absorbing conquered populations so thoroughly, by spreading Mongol forces across such vast territories, by creating millions of subjects with memories of what had been taken from them. Genghis Khan's descendants inherited an empire too vast to control, too diverse to unify, too haunted to endure. Within 3 generations of his death, the unified Mongol Empire would splinter into competing khanates. Within 5 generations, many Mongols would adopt the religions, languages, and cultures of those they had conquered. The conquerors were, in turn, conquered not by armies, but by the slow insistence of culture, the quiet resistance of memory. In 1370, a Turco-Mongol conqueror named Timur would choose Samarkand as his capital, rebuilding it into an architectural wonder that eclipsed even its pre-1220 glory. The city Genghis Khan had broken would rise again, more magnificent than before. Its mosques and madrasas among the most beautiful structures humans have ever created. Timur himself was descended from Mongols, but he built in the Persian style, governed using Islamic law, and surrounded himself with scholars who preserved the very cultural traditions the original invasion had tried to destroy. The women of Samarkand left no monuments, no armies, no chronicles bearing their names. But they left children who remembered their mothers' languages, refugees who carried manuscripts to safety, survivors who whispered stories that would not die. The conquerors' names filled history books. The victims' names faded. But whose influence ultimately shaped the future? In the archive in Tashkent, there is a manuscript fragment that might be part of Zainab's journal. The calligraphy matches the style of her era. The content describes Samarkand's gardens before the fall. It was donated by a family who claimed descent from survivors, preserved through 27 generations, each taught to remember why it mattered. The paper is brittle now, the ink faded, but the words remain legible. The final line reads, "I write this so that something of us continues, even if only as shadows on a page." She succeeded. 800 years later, we are reading her words, speaking her city's name, bearing witness to what was done and what endured. The Mongol Empire is dust. Samarkand still stands. That is not justice. But it is a kind of victory that cannot be taken by force, because it exists in the realm where armies cannot reach in memory, in telling, in the stubborn refusal of stories to die even when their tellers are silenced. The light in the citadel that turned strange and orange on that March day in 1220 eventually gave way to darkness. But darkness, it turns out, is not the same as oblivion. Sometimes it is just the space where survivors light candles, where fragments are gathered, where the work of remembering begins. The women of Samarkand could not defeat the Mongol horde, but they outlasted it. In the long accounting of history that matters more than we imagine.